Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn, Colorado's Missing Bride by Kat Lynn, Chapter 1. Brooklyn, New York, 1870. Gail Dwight fidgeted on the couch as her eyes darted towards the open door in agitation. She loathed being kept waiting. Her parents should have been home earlier, but 2 hours later, they still hadn't shown up. Feeling that she couldn't wait any longer, she walked over to the dining table and banged on the table loud enough for Elisa to hear. Elisa was the family's housekeeper, and the poor girl had been cowering in the kitchen since Gail's tantrums began. Upon hearing the loud bang, Elisa rushed to the drawing room to be confronted by a fuming Gail. "How long must I call for you before you answer?" a furious Gail asked as soon as Elisa set foot in the room. "But I didn't hear you call for me, miss," Elisa timidly answered. "Are you calling me a liar?" Gail asked as she glared fiercely at the housekeeper. "No, I didn't mean to, miss," Elisa answered, her gaze to the floor. In times like these, she knew it was best to accept whatever insult to appease the pesky lady. She needed this job to help her parents back home. Mr. and Mrs. Dwight had also been kind to her, and had it not been for them, she would have left a long time ago. It was a pity that they had someone like Gail for a daughter. "Serve my dinner," Gail directed. Elisa hesitated for a moment, and Gail shot her a vicious look. "What are you waiting for?" "I thought we should wait for Mr. and Mrs. Dwight," Elisa answered, head bowed. "Don't think. Get my food." Gail thundered, and Elisa hurriedly scampered to the kitchen. The following morning, there still were no signs of her parents. Gail wondered whether they'd gone on a trip without letting her know, but that was impossible. Now a bit rattled, she decided to go to her parents' railroad company and talk to the workers. She sent for the coachman, and they set out shortly after. Gail thought she had been driven to the wrong location. The building was covered in dark soot, and rings of smoke still billowed from where her parents' office once was. A few of the workers she could recognize sat on the ground, pensive looks on their faces. "What happened?" she asked as she approached one of the men. "Your father's office burnt down yesterday, miss," the man answered. "Where are my parents?" She pressed on. "They were both in the office at the time. I'm afraid they perished in the fire, miss," the man answered, and Gail's face dropped. He felt sorry for her. Due to her abrasive behavior, no one had been willing to go and break the sad news to her. The ride back home was agonizing for Gail. She had always depended on her parents for everything that she needed. How was she going to cope with their sudden demise? She neither had any relatives nor any friends. The only person she had left was Elisa. Breaking the sad news to the housekeeper was hard, but Elisa promised to stay on until after the burial. She couldn't understand why this tragedy had to befall such a selfless couple. Days after the burial, Gail realized how lonely she would be in the house. Elisa was getting ready to leave, and no amount of persuasion would make her stay. She had stayed on for this long because of Mr. and Mrs. Dwight's kindness, and since they weren't here anymore, she could no longer stay. She would find another job soon, that she was sure of. The will was to be read in a few days, and Gail couldn't stop daydreaming. The sadness she had felt earlier about losing her parents was wearing off. She was soon coming into money, and that was all she could think about. She would find another housekeeper and spend her days doing whatever her heart desired. Suddenly, being alone in the world didn't sound so bad after all. Gilbert, the family lawyer, arrived at the house 3 days later, and Gail was beside herself with excitement as she led him into her father's study. There was nothing much to discuss, as she was sure that her parents had left her all they owned. "Well, Miss Dwight, let's get to it," the lawyer said after declining a cup of tea. He wanted to get over with it and get to other business of the day. "Yes, Mr. Gilbert, I suppose we should." Gail answered, the excitement in her voice palpable. "As you know, your parents left you everything they owned. Gilbert started as Gail's eyes grew wide with expectation. But there is a condition attached to it. What condition? Gail asked, color draining from her face. You are to be married first before you can access your inheritance, Gilbert explained to a baffled Gail. That's quite a condition, Gail said as she stared blankly at Gilbert. Gilbert nodded. It's quite an inheritance, too. That evening, Gail sat at home and pondered her new life. Where would she find a husband? She had ignored all the suitors she'd had despite her mother's eager persuasions. Most of them had gone on to get married, and the few who were still single wouldn't give her the time of day. She was angry that her parents had demanded that the clause be in the will. They were aware that she didn't have a suitor, and neither had she been searching for one. She had wasted most of the allowance her parents had been giving her. The little she had left would only last a few months or even less. She couldn't imagine herself working for anyone. It seemed the only solution left was to do as stated in the will. She would have to find a husband. She had no idea where to begin or how to go about it. All she knew was that she would do anything to get a man to marry her. This was no time to go looking for a man to love or any of those emotional shenanigans. This would purely be a business arrangement, privy only to her. Chapter 2. Denver, Colorado, 1870. Thomas Lucas kicked the sides of his horse, and the animal slowed down to a trot. He was now close enough to his brother's Eric, newly built house. Life had changed so much since his two elder brothers moved out of their parents' ranch house. What he hadn't expected was the lonely pang in his heart for female companionship. Maybe seeing both his brothers so happily married could have contributed as well. One day, while talking to Mrs. Anderson, who'd visited the ranch, she turned to him and smiled. I can see your need for a wife, the old lady said, smiling knowingly, and Thomas had been taken aback. How did she know? Is it that obvious? He asked, marveling at her insight. I know you like you were my own son, she replied. You could place an ad in the local daily. Thomas stared at the old lady, baffled, but she only winked at him and walked away. He had been mulling over this for the longest time, and now that someone else had spoken about it, could have been the sign he longed for. He only needed to affirm with his brother, and then his mind would be at ease. Now, as he rode towards Eric's house, his mind was in turmoil, wondering what Eric's input would be. Hopefully, Eric would tell him that he was doing the right thing. He knocked on the front door, and Lindsay happily welcomed him inside. So good to see you, Thomas, she exclaimed as soon as he was inside the house. Thomas couldn't help but think that his brother had married the best one. He could only hope that he would be that lucky as well. Good to see you too, Lindsay, he answered as he let himself be led to a couch. Lindsay offered him a cup of tea before heading off to let her husband know that his brother had arrived. A short while later, Eric and Thomas sat together on the couch, speaking in low tones. Lindsay had passed by twice, and she couldn't figure out what the two were talking about. It must have been serious, as Thomas, who was always cracking jokes, now seemed engrossed in what his brother was telling him. I think that's the best way to go, Thomas, Eric assured his brother. How will I know whom to choose? Thomas asked, and Eric smiled. Your heart won't let you down, Eric replied. I don't want anyone to know about this until the lady is due to arrive, Thomas said. Sure, Thomas. I will happily return the favor, Eric said, and the two brothers smiled at each other knowingly. His heart now at peace, Thomas rode back home, determined more than ever to go ahead with posting the ad in the Matrimonial Times the following day. Arriving back at the ranch, his younger brothers were happily chatting away, and with just a wave to acknowledge his presence, he walked to his room and locked the door behind him. He spent a considerable amount of time pondering on how to write the ad without sounding too desperate. After what seemed like an eternity, he plucked enough courage and penned down exactly what was on his mind. A gentleman rancher in Denver seeks the companionship of a young, kind-hearted lady. She should be ready to adapt to life on a ranch and ready to start a family in the near future. He went over and over the ad until he was satisfied that the message was precise and to the point. If there was anything else to add, then that would have to happen during their correspondence. A brilliant thought crossed his mind. He would pass by Mrs. Anderson's grocery store and have her take a look at the ad before posting it. That settled, he neatly folded the small piece of paper, placed it on his writing desk, and went to the drawing room to join his brothers for dinner. Thomas was up by the crack of dawn the next day. He had been too excited about the events of the day so that he hadn't had a good night's sleep, but that was not important to him then. He would sleep as much as he wanted after the mission was completed. As soon he was finished with breakfast, Thomas hurriedly saddled his horse and rode off, leaving a huge cloud of dust behind him. "Good morning, Mrs. Anderson. I'm glad to find you here," Thomas called out as soon as he arrived at the old lady's store to find her already there. "Good morning to you too, Thomas. I'm an early bird," Mrs. Anderson answered in her usual bubbly self. "I need you to take a look at this," Thomas said as he handed her the small written note. Her eyes quickly skimmed over the note before a huge smile covered her entire face. "I see you have finally done it. Well done, my boy," she exclaimed as she enveloped the man in a huge bear hug. "What do you think?" Thomas asked after they broke apart. "I say, let's post it," she said, sounding more excited than him. As if wanting to make sure he actually posted the ad, Mrs. Anderson took Thomas's hand in hers, and together they walked into the postal exchange. Finally, the ad was out there for all and sundry to see, Thomas thought. Thomas thanked the kind lady for her assistance and set out on his way back home. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest he could hear it. He could now understand why his brother Luke had behaved the way he had, as well as the nervousness he had seen in Eric. He knew it would take a while before he received a reply, but he wished he could somehow rush the time to make it happen sooner. Chapter 3. Gail walked over to the range and attempted to light the stove once again, but it was a flop the second time as well. Elisa had already left, and Gail now appreciated how important Elisa's presence had been in the house. Finally, the stove was lit, and she placed a kettle with water to boil for tea. She paced around impatiently, waiting for the water to boil, but it seemed to be taking ages. She went to move it, and the handle snapped off and came away in her hand, spilling some of the hot liquid on her palm. "Ouch," she wailed in pain, vigorously rubbing the scalded skin on the skirts of her dress. Tears of frustration rolled down her cheeks, and she did not attempt to wipe them away. Anguished, Gail did her best to prepare her tea, but the taste just wasn't as good as Elisa's. She slowly sipped on it, reality finally dawning on her that she truly was all alone in the world. Had it not been for the clause in the will, she would have already hired another housekeeper, and life wouldn't have been this hard. She then remembered that there wasn't enough food left in the larder, and her mind raced. She'd never had to worry about such menial tasks before, and she found herself resentful of having to do so now. After breakfast, Gail thought it best to go to the general store and stock up the larder, or she would surely starve in a few days. The coachman had left days after the burial as well, but that didn't bother her much. She'd taken the coach by herself before, and she was well familiar with its mechanisms. What bothered her most were the cold stares she would have to endure from the town folk. She arrived at the store an hour later and headed straight to the vegetable section. She could feel the icy cold stares from the store's owner, Mrs. Madsen, and her plain daughter, Mabel. A few years back, Mabel had taken a liking to a young man who only had eyes for Gail. Mabel, in turn, had blamed Gail for her misfortunes and branded her an enemy. Gail didn't return the young man's affections, and he had left town heartbroken. This only made Mabel despise Gail even more, and it seemed Mabel's mother felt the same way. Undeterred, Gail picked up the provisions that she needed, and as she walked to the front counter to pay, her eyes fell on the day's daily's front page. A large photo of the young man Gail had snubbed years earlier, and a beautiful young lady stared back at her. They were announcing their engagement, and Gail could tell that the lady came from an affluent family. Gail stared at the photo in shock. She couldn't believe the young weakling of a man she had mistreated years ago was marrying such a classy lady. Overcome with curiosity, she decided to buy the newspaper as well and read all the details later that night. That will be a $50, 20 cents. Mrs. Madson's icy voice cut through the air like a knife. Very well, Gail answered as she handed the money over to the elderly lady. She thought she heard Mabel smirk in the background, but she didn't pay her much attention. That evening, after a simple dinner, which Gail had painstakingly struggled to prepare, she pulled out the newspaper and read over the details about the couple's engagement. The newspaper was appropriately named the Matrimonial Times, and Gail could only smile at the title. She ruefully recalled the many times she'd rejected the young man's romantic advances. She wondered where she would be now had she accepted. A bit sad, Gail flicked through the rest of the paper until she came to a section where there were tons of advertisements from young men from the West searching for brides from the East. Gail had heard about mail-order brides, but she always told herself she wasn't that desperate to try such an unconventional way of finding a husband.
Yes, I do.
But from where she stood now, that seemed to be the only way out for her. She barely slept that night as she went through the ads, trying to see who'd fit well into her plan. She settled on a young man from Colorado named Thomas. Something about him stood out to her, and she penned a reply that same evening. She would post it the following day and hope that he would reply. The reply came a few weeks later, and Gail promptly replied, and thus began their correspondence. Gail never mentioned that she was an heiress, fearing that information would somehow spook him. When he finally proposed, Gail was over the moon, and all she could think about was how she was about to become rich. He sent her a photograph of himself for when he came to pick her up at the station. He looked quite handsome, and Gail felt a bit sorry that she was deceiving him in this way. She sent him one as well, and he said he thought she was very beautiful, which stroked Gail's ego even more. As Gail's departure day approached, feelings of apprehension filled her heart. What if the man was as a good liar as she was? She would be back in Brooklyn, without a husband, and without a penny to her name. She didn't think she would be able to go through the same process a second time. He had sent her enough money to make sure she traveled as comfortably as can be. Surely that must count for something, she thought. As the day approached, Gail's fears intensified, but she had no other choice. She had to remind herself as well that her intentions were not honorable. There was no other way but to pack up, travel to Colorado, and confront whatever fate awaited her there. Chapter 4. Thomas arrived at Mrs. Anderson's general store at around noon, his heart racing wildly with anxiety. The old lady had promised to help him pick out a few things she felt Gail would appreciate finding in her room. Since Eric's wife Lindsay moved out, the room had been neglected and was in dire need of a facelift. Thomas wanted Gail to be happy from the first moment she set eyes on the room. There you are, and right on time, I see. Is everything going well at home, dear? Mrs. Anderson asked, as cheerful as ever. Yes, Mrs. Anderson, I can hardly wait for Gail to get here, Thomas answered. But why do you look troubled? Mrs. Anderson pried on. I don't know whether she will like her room or even like it here, Thomas answered, and Mrs. Anderson could see how the issue weighed heavily on the young man's shoulders. Oh, fret not, she definitely will. Shall we? She assured him, and Thomas felt better almost immediately. They walked across the road to the mercantile store, and Mrs. Anderson picked up new bed linens, a new lamp, a wardrobe, and a pair of window drapes. The mattress and the bed frame back at home were still in good shape. This should be enough for her to be getting on with, she said. I shall pass by later in the evening to help you set up. I can't thank you enough, ma'am, Thomas said, relief evident on his face. Oh, think nothing of it, dear, she shrugged, bid Thomas goodbye, and rushed back to her store. As Thomas rode back home, his mind was in turmoil. Gail's arrival day was near, and he still felt like there were things he hadn't done to make her feel welcome. The tone in her letters pointed towards a lady possessed of means, and he worried he wouldn't be able to keep up with her. She had mentioned that she had recently lost her parents, but Thomas still couldn't shake off the feeling that she hadn't told him everything. He saw the outline of his house in the distance, and he decided to push all the negative thoughts to the back of his mind. His brothers were waiting for him to see what he'd bought for his fiancée, and he didn't want them noticing that something was bothering him. "This one is too heavy." Greg, the youngest of the brothers, complained as he and his older brother Henry carried the wardrobe into the house. "You sure do complain a lot, Greg," Henry said as they paused to catch their breath. "I bet no one will want to help you when you bring your fiancé over." "Me? Don't worry about it. I'm never getting married. This is too much work," Greg complained as they picked up the wardrobe once again, carrying it up the stairs. He could hear Henry softly chuckling behind him. Once in the room, they placed the wardrobe in one corner and stood panting near the window as they waited for their elder brothers to bring the rest of the stuff into the room. They could hear Storm and Eric chatting heartily as they walked up the stairs with the rest of the items. "Where should we place all this?" Eric asked, looking around the room. It looked quite different from the time he'd spruced it up for Lindsay. Time had passed, and the room had been left unused. "Don't worry about that. Mrs. Anderson will stop by in the evening and guide me on what goes where," Thomas answered to the relief of his clueless brothers. "Will she be cooking dinner for us as well?" Henry asked excitedly. "I don't think so. We should be the ones to cook for her and thank her for always being there for us," Thomas said, and they all turned to look at him in surprise. He'd turned all philosophical since finding himself a fiancé. "Getting married is sure good on you. I can hardly believe this new you," Greg shrugged, and the rest burst out in laughter. "You should try it sometime." Prostem sent. "It would be great to see how you turn out, Greg," Thomas said. "I've already told Henry I'm never getting married," Greg shot back. "Then you will be the loneliest old man on this planet," Storm said, and the rest nodded in affirmation. Greg remained unmoved, and Storm hoped his kid brother was only joking. "Well, I might change my mind in a few years," Greg shrugged. He had noticed how bothered Storm became by his comments. It reminded them of the darkness that had befallen the family a few years back, and though no one spoke about it now as much, it was still firmly etched in their minds. Later that evening, Mrs. Anderson showed up like she'd promised, and together with Thomas went up to Gail's room. She'd point out where an item was supposed to be placed, and Thomas would oblige. Half an hour later, the room looked perfect, and both Mrs. Anderson and Thomas were quite pleased with the final outcome. "What do you think?" Mrs. Anderson asked, smiling, clearly very proud of her work. "She's going to love it, I'm sure," Thomas replied, a little hesitation in his voice. "It's going to be all right, dear. You just need to relax, and everything will fall into place," she answered, and she gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. That night, Thomas tossed and turned in his bed, sleep failing him. Gail would be arriving the next day, and this was the most nerve-wracking night of his life. He got out of bed, went over to his reading desk, and took out her picture. He stared at it, willing the face looking back at him to tell him something, anything. Nothing happened. Thomas realized that he didn't need to take it with him to the station the following day. He had looked at it so many times that he had memorized it. Prosody. Chapter 5. "Your ticket, miss," the conductor said as he stood close to Gail, his foot tapping impatiently on the train's floor. "Hold on, I'm still looking for it," Gail answered in agitation as she rummaged furiously inside a second bag. She couldn't quite remember where she had placed it. "You should always have your ticket ready for inspection, miss, whenever you are traveling," the man went on. Why on earth did she have to travel with so many suitcases? He wondered in bewilderment. "I just told you that I'm still looking for it. Are you hard of hearing or what?" She snapped again, and the young man was taken aback. How rude. A lady seated on the other side of the aisle with her 2 children shot Gail a disapproving look, but Gail was unfazed. "What are you looking at? This doesn't concern you," she yelled, and the lady looked away, not wanting to be drawn into the debacle. "There is no need to be rude, miss," the conductor said this time, his voice more mellow. He couldn't understand why the young lady had such a foul temper. "Here it is," Gail said as she shoved the piece of paper into the man's open palm. "That will be all, miss. Have a wonderful trip," the conductor said, but received no acknowledgement. Gail stared at the conductor's retreating back, wondering what she was doing on this train. The air was hot and dusty. making it hard to breathe well. She seemed to be the only one bothered as the other passengers looked comfortable, with some even smiling and conversing in low tones. She had been told that the trip would last up to 3 weeks. They hadn't even left Brooklyn, and yet she was already getting irritated. The two children on the other aisle screamed and shouted as their mother sat in complete silence, pretending not to hear them. Gail was at her wits' end. She hoped and prayed that the mother took notice and quieted them down. The train finally started on its way, and Gail heaved a sigh of relief as she settled back in the seat. The heat was now becoming too much, and all she could do was fan her face with her handkerchief, which didn't help much. She found herself wondering how poor Thomas was that he couldn't have sent her enough money to travel first class. It didn't matter. Once their marriage was officiated, she would hop on the next train back to Brooklyn and away from what she believed was a poor, wretched country town. Gail's thoughts strayed to what she stood to gain once she was married. Since her parents took care of everything she ever needed, she'd never been interested in how the railroad company was run. "You should come to work with us, dear, one of these fine days," her father had once told her as they sat around the table having breakfast. "It's important for you to know how the company works." "Oh, Pa, I couldn't be bothered. I'm not cut out for that kind of work," she had answered as she rolled her eyes. "But you should be, dear. This will all be yours one day." Her mother had intervened, hoping to talk some sense into her daughter. "I know, and I will employ the best workers to do the work for me," Gail had replied nonchalantly as she lazily chewed on her bread. Now, as the train rattled down the street, she still didn't want to learn to run the company. Only now she had decided that she would sell the company. Gail felt she didn't want to be tied down by having to look after the business. She could picture herself with a lot of money, living a life of luxury without a care in the world. The next days on the train were uneventful, and Gail found herself enjoying the scenery and relaxing quite a bit. They had by now left the bustle of the city, and the air had become cooler as well. A few of her fellow passengers had tried to engage Gail in conversation, but she had shunned them all. Eventually, they in turn had resolved to let her be, and Gail was more than grateful to be left alone. Most of them now threw her distasteful looks, wondering how a lady so beautiful and seemingly classy would have such a foul attitude. "She must be one of those spoilt brats," one elderly lady said to the passenger with the two toddlers. "I know, and she doesn't seem to like children very much. Mine are terrified of her," the passenger answered. She had noticed how Gail would glare at her children whenever they made noise. "It's such a pity. Such a lovely lady would have made a beautiful bride. But with an attitude like that, no man worth his salt would ever make her his wife." The elderly lady snickered as the other one nodded in acknowledgement. Unbeknownst to them, Gail heard every single word they spoke, but she'd pretended to be asleep. She didn't care what they thought about her. They had no idea what she planned on doing or what her life was like. She would be a millionaire and would never have to travel with common people like them ever again. The lady's children woke up with a start and started hollering at the top of their lungs, making Gail's head hurt. What a nuisance, she thought as she clenched her teeth in anger. It took every ounce in her body not to go over to them and shut them up herself. Their mother made futile attempts to calm them down, but this only seemed to agitate them further, and they screamed even louder. More than ever now, Gail wished she'd get to her destination sooner, get married, and go back to her exciting city life. Chapter 6. The train pulled into the station and came to a stop. Passengers started disembarking, with some excitedly rushing outside to meet their friends and relatives. Gail reached into one of her bags and pulled out Thomas's photograph. She had looked at it maybe twice or thrice since he'd sent it in his last letter. He had promised to be waiting at the station, and Gail hoped he'd kept his word. She'd hate for him to keep her waiting, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. Noticing that she was almost the last one to get off the train, Gail hastily reached under her seat for the rest of her luggage. She pulled out one bag, and it took all her strength to finally place it by her side. Almost out of breath, Gail looked around helplessly, hoping that someone would notice and come to her rescue. Nobody bothered. They all cast her side glances as they hurriedly walked down the steps and disappeared into the sea of people. "Do you need help, miss?" The young conductor she'd mistreated at the start of the journey finally came to her rescue. "Yes, can you carry these bags outside for me?" Gail answered, her nose in the air. He carried each of the bags, laid them outside on the ground, and came back to help Gail down the steps. "There you are, miss," he said, but Gail just shrugged and said nothing. The nerve! He turned and walked back to the train, hoping to never encounter such an arrogant passenger again. Gail held the photograph tightly in her hands as she looked around, hoping to spot Thomas. The sun bore down mercilessly on her, and she could feel tiny streaks of sweat rolling down the small of her back. She wished to get to a shelter, but couldn't move her heavy suitcases. "Miss Dwight?" a voice said closely. She turned to look and immediately knew that it was Thomas. "Mr. Lucas," she said with a wan smile. She held out her gloved hand, assuming that he was ready to accept it. He took it and pressed his lips against it lightly. "It's so very nice to finally meet you," he said. "And you," she replied. She wondered how long it would take him to get her away from the scorching sun. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing the look on her face. "This heat is too much," she said as she frantically fanned her face with her open palm. "I'm so sorry about that. Let's get you out of here then," he said. "Is this all the luggage you have?" "Yes, those 3, she said, avoiding his gaze. He picked up the 3 bags, but realized that he couldn't carry all of them at the same time. They were too heavy. What was she carrying? Rocks, perhaps? He mused. "My cart is around the corner. Let me take those 2 first." "I will be back shortly for you and the remaining bag," he said, and she nodded. Gail watched as Thomas walked away. He was a little taller than she had expected, about 6'5", and she could tell he spent much time in the sun. His hair, though most of it covered by the wide-brimmed cowboy hat he wore, was lighter than in his picture. His gait was strong and confident as he strode away, the bag seemingly weightless in his muscular arms. Thomas came back shortly and led Gail towards his cart. She walked closely behind him, afraid that one wrong move and she would lose him in the crowd. The dust kept getting into her eyes, and at some point she could hardly see what was in front of her. A few strands of hair had escaped her bonnet, and she could feel them sticking to her forehead. She tried to set them free, but her hands were clammy with sweat, and she only made everything worse. "Here we are," Thomas said as he threw her remaining bag at the back bench of the funny-looking contraption. "What is that?" she asked. "That's my cart. We will ride in this back to the ranch," he said, amused by her ignorance. "You've never seen one like it before?" "No, I have never. We don't have such back at home," she answered. Thomas helped Gail onto the cart, and he could see how uncomfortable she was. The ride was bumpy at first, but it became a bit smoother as they got a little further from the train station. Thomas would steal glances at Gail, trying to read what was going on in her mind. Her photograph hadn't done her justice. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on. Her face was oval-shaped with huge almond eyes framed by long curly lashes and a milky white complexion. Her curly auburn hair framed her face beautifully, even though some of it was soaked in sweat and stuck to her forehead. It didn't matter. She was still stunning. Her hands covered in white lace gloves were folded delicately on her lap. "Where is your ranch?" she asked him, a bit more loudly than she intended. "It's a little out of town," he answered. "How far out?" She pried on. "About 10 miles, he said as he turned away to hide a smile. 10 miles, she gasped, her eyes wide in shock. "Okay, I was joking. It's only 2 miles, he said like it was nothing. "Well, I don't appreciate it. You never mentioned that in your letters," she said in an annoyed tone. She had never lived more than a few minutes away from something she might need back in the city. She fell silent, and Thomas could tell that she was furious. He was puzzled, as he had thought it was obvious to her that a ranch wouldn't be at the center of a town. He worried about what else would set her off. It began dawning on him that even though Gail was quite pleasing to the eye, there was a lot that he didn't know about her. He would have to brace himself for tougher times ahead with her. He could feel it in his gut. Chapter 7. They rode in silence, each engrossed in their own thoughts. Gail looked out over the land and saw some buildings in the near distance, but with the heat haze, she couldn't make them out properly. One was a house, she was sure, and the other was a structure of some sort. She'd never seen one like it before. "There it is," Thomas announced, and Gail felt a sinking feeling come over her. "What is?" she timidly asked. "There, that's my house." "It's where we are going," he answered excitedly, pointing towards the house. "Is that all there is?" she asked. "Yes," Thomas answered. "Did you expect something different?" "Of course I did. That whole house is the size of my drawing room back home," she answered, and Thomas was taken aback by her sense of entitlement. "Well, I suggest you get used to it. That's quite a large ranch house here in Denver," he answered through gritted teeth. "I suppose I should. What is that structure next to the house?" she asked. "That's a barn. And for Pete's sake, don't you know anything about the West?" Thomas shot back, now becoming irritated by her ignorance. "Why should I? I've lived in New York all my life," she retorted and turned away from him. Thomas drew in a deep breath to calm himself. Gail was now testing his patience, and he was afraid he would lose it if he engaged her again. He thought of turning the cart back and taking her back to the train station, but then thought against it. That wouldn't be very manly of him. He resolved to keep quiet for the rest of the ride home. "Give me your hand. I'll help you down," Thomas said when they arrived at the ranch, and she gingerly gave him her gloved hand. Once safely on the ground, Gail looked around her contemptuously, her lips drawn into a disapproving line. Everything looked old and not up to her standards. Perhaps coming here had been a tall order, and she wondered whether she would last until the wedding day. The house was a bit bigger than she'd thought earlier, but it still was small, according to her. The landscape, she had to admit, was stunning. Thomas silently observed her without saying a word. There was none needed. The expression on her face was enough to let him know that she didn't like anything here. It was good that his brothers were all out, going about their business. They would have been angered by her foul attitude. "Come see inside," he said as he walked towards the front door. Gail followed him, holding up the skirts of her dress, lest they swept the dusty yard. They went up the staircase to the second floor. He let her wander about and look at each room before taking her to a door, opening it, and showing her the room she'd be occupying until they were married. "Not quite what I expected, but it could have been worse," Gail said as she walked into the room with Thomas close behind her. He placed the 2 bags he'd been carrying on the floor and went back out to bring the rest. Left alone, Gail looked around the room once more. It was sparse but well appointed. The linens and the window drapes were fabulous. It was better than she could have imagined. She admitted to herself with honesty this time. She heard Thomas coming back up the stairs and quickly pretended to be busy with the bags lying on the floor. "I will leave you to freshen up, but I will be back to bring you down for dinner with my brothers in the evening," Thomas said as he stood in the doorway. "Are you the one preparing dinner?" she asked. "No. Our chaperone, Mrs. Anderson, will take care of that. She will be here shortly," he replied. "Oh," Gail answered and turned away from him. Taking the cue, Thomas shut the door behind him and walked back down the stairs. It was almost dark when Thomas knocked on Gail's door. After a short wait, she came to the door, and Thomas was stunned. She wore a flowing pastel dress that fitted her slender body to perfection. Her hair, which had earlier stuck to her forehead, was now free of the bonnet, and the curls danced freely on her head. Huge, almond-shaped eyes stared boldly at him, and he found himself breathless, fiddling with his hat. "You are late. I have been waiting for a while," she admonished him. "I apologize for that. Shall we?" he said as he offered her the crook of his elbow, and she, in turn, hooked her arm into his. "Here they are, come on in, you two." Mrs. Anderson happily welcomed them as Thomas's brothers stared at Gail in awe. She was breathtaking. Gail thought the old lady was making a big fuss over nothing as she slowly appraised Thomas's brothers. They were quite good-looking, and from their banter, they seemed to be like a very close-knit family. For the first time, a pang of loneliness cut through Gail's heart, taking her by surprise. All her life, She'd been very comfortable being an only child and had never wished for a sibling until now. "Have a seat," Thomas said as he pulled a chair out for her. "Thank you," she said, feigning a smile as she took her seat. Mrs. Anderson was looking at Gail, and something about her aura unsettled her. She'd never had that feeling with Violet or even Lindsay. Something about Gail was not right, but she couldn't put a finger on it. Thomas looked sad and withdrawn for a man who just welcomed his soon-to-be wife. This was unlike him, and Mrs. Anderson couldn't shake the feeling that this young lady might not be a good fit for her dear Thomas. Chapter 8. Gail woke up with a start, the noises in the house too loud to ignore. Listening more keenly, she heard people walking around and chatting in low tones. It took her a few minutes to finally realize where she was. She slowly got out of bed, went to the window, and looked out. It was still dark, and she couldn't understand what the ruckus was all about so early in the morning. She listened again, and the noises were now slowly drifting away. A door opened and then closed. A few minutes later, all was quiet, and Gail went back to bed. The sun was up when she finally woke up. She was still angry that she had been disturbed in the morning and was determined to get some answers when she went down for breakfast. She'd only been here 2 days, and already everything was beginning to irritate her. Life here was worse than she'd imagined. The air reeked of animal waste, and the weather was hot with dust blowing everywhere. Thomas had told her they were to be married in 4 days, and that was what was keeping her here. "Good morning, Miss Dwight. It's such a pleasant morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Anderson greeted Gail in her usual cheerful way when they met in the hallway, only to be met with a cold stare. "What's so pleasant about it? It's terribly hot here, and on top of that, I was woken up in the wee hours of the morning by all the noise. Whoever wakes up that early?" Gail replied in her usual arrogant way. "Well, Miss Dwight, I'll have you know that around here folks wake up at the break of dawn. There is so much to do in the morning, unlike where you come from," Mrs. Anderson replied, her earlier misgivings about Gail now fully affirmed. "In that case, they should be more careful not to wake those who are sleeping," Gail replied. "I suggest you get used to it, miss," Mrs. Anderson replied, her patience wearing thin. "It won't be for too long, I can assure you," Gail mumbled under her breath. "What was that, miss?" Mrs. Anderson asked. "Never mind," Gail shot back and walked away. Mrs. Anderson watched Gail's retreating back, and her heart broke for Thomas. Gail didn't behave like someone's fiancé. She was supposed to be learning all she could from Mrs. Anderson, but instead, she treated her like her personal maid. It was clear to the older lady that Gail had no idea what a chaperone was or what her purpose was. She would have to talk to Thomas about the issue. But Mrs. Anderson was worried that the matter would only confuse poor Thomas even more. "Miss Dwight, maybe you should accompany me to the kitchen and help me with breakfast? I could show you a thing or two about how to go about it," she said when Gail returned to the house. "I shan't be here after the wedding to guide you, so I suggest you take full advantage now that I'm available." "I don't think so. I have never had to do that type of work before," Gail shrugged as she went past Mrs. Anderson heading to the drawing room. Speechless, Mrs. Anderson went to the kitchen and set about preparing breakfast. Now more than ever, she needed to speak to Thomas. It would be a pity to have to send a bride back to her hometown even before she was married. But they would have to do it if Gail didn't change her ways. She couldn't understand why Gail chose to come all the way, knowing that she wasn't ready to get married. Busying herself by the range, Mrs. Anderson pushed all the negative thoughts to the back of her mind. Breakfast needed to be ready by the time the brothers came back, and she couldn't see Gail lending a hand. Gail heard as the older lady moved about in the kitchen, pots and pans banging as she moved them about. There was no doubt that Mrs. Anderson was very fond of Thomas and his siblings. It was unfortunate, though, that she thought Gail was here to stay. A few times, Gail had been tempted to blurt out the whole truth to the older lady, but that would only jeopardize her well-laid plans. A short while later, she heard the brothers return and quickly went back up to her room. She needed for Thomas to think that she hadn't left her room since waking up. Breakfast that morning was a quiet affair, as everyone seemed to be deep in thought. Mrs. Anderson watched from her seat as Gail picked at her food, a weird expression on her face. She threw a glance at Thomas, who sat quietly as he slowly ate his food. Henry and Greg ate their food quietly as well. The whole scene unsettled Mrs. Anderson, as she'd never known the brothers to sit without talking or joking around with each other. "When is the wedding going to be again?" she asked as she looked at Thomas. "I will be in 2 days, Mrs. Anderson." "Why do you ask?" Thomas asked. "It's not for any particular reason. I just need to go back to my store. We will soon have our busiest season yet," she answered. "Oh yes, Mrs. Anderson, Christmas is almost upon us," Greg exclaimed. "It's always the best time of the year. I hope this time Luke will be with us," Henry said in a sad tone. "Yes, Henry, I hope so too. We all do," Thomas answered. Gail wondered who Luke was, but she didn't care much. He must be a farmhand who'd left and now they all missed and wanted him back, she mused. Chapter 9. Mrs. Anderson tried to get Thomas alone for the rest of the day, but it proved futile. She wanted to share her fears with him without the interference of the other brothers. With only 2 days left to the wedding, there was little time left to stop Thomas from making the biggest mistake of his life. She'd try that evening after dinner, she decided. "Mrs. Anderson, is something on your mind?" A voice behind her asked, startling her. She quickly turned to find Henry standing there with a concerned look on his face. "No, not all. I'm only thinking about Thomas's wedding and whether everything had been sorted out," she answered, as she feigned a smile and Henry saw through it. "Mrs. Anderson, you wouldn't keep anything from me now, would you?" He pressed on. "Oh, Henry, you are right. I can't keep this to myself anymore," she answered, as she let out a slow, anguished breath. "What is it? Are you ill?" Henry asked, panicked. "No, Henry, I'm not sick. It's about Thomas and his fiancée," she answered, and Henry looked at her confused. "What about them?" he asked. "Have you noticed anything amiss about Miss Dwight?" she asked. "Yes, Mrs. Anderson, she is beautiful," Henry answered with a big smile, and Mrs. Anderson knew that she'd lost him. "Well, that she is, but I'm afraid that's not enough," she sighed. "Could you get Thomas to talk to me after dinner? I can't seem to find him anywhere." "Of course I will. I will be with him later in the afternoon, and I will let him know," Henry answered, puzzled by Mrs. Anderson's behavior. Long after Henry had left, Mrs. Anderson sat alone in the drawing room, deep in thought. Could she be blowing this whole issue out of proportion? It would be a big problem if she were the only one seeing any fault in Gail. Her fondness towards the boys could be clouding her judgment and making her see issues that weren't really there. She would talk to Gail first, ask her a few questions, and see if she was persecuting her unfairly. She knew that Gail had gone up to her room after lunch. It would be best to talk to her then in the hope that she was wrong. She knocked on Gail's door, and the young lady came to the door and invited her inside. She was immaculately dressed as always, and Mrs. Anderson could understand why that was the only thing that Henry noticed about Gail. "Mrs. Anderson, what can I help you with?" she impatiently asked, and the older lady's heart sank further. She wasn't wrong about Gail after all. She thought of making an excuse and turning back, but then decided against it. "Oh, it's nothing much, dear. I just wanted to know a little bit more about you. You know, about your parents and whether you have siblings," the older lady said, careful not to set her off. "There is nothing much to tell. I'm from New York, an only child, and an orphan. As you can see, Mrs. Anderson, my life is not that interesting," she said, and it was obvious that she wasn't being truthful. "Are you happy to be here? I mean, do you really want to marry Thomas?" Mrs. Anderson asked. "Of course I am. Why else would I have come all this way with this heat and dust?" Gail asked now, beginning to get annoyed. "And why does it sound like you are interrogating me?" "Don't be offended, Miss Dwight. As your chaperone, it's only fair that I know a few things about you, is all," she answered. "Well, if you will excuse me, I will leave now." "Close the door behind you," Gail said as she turned and went to stand by the window. She could tell that the old lady was very suspicious of her, and she had every right to be. She had to admit as well that she was a bit jealous of how Mrs. Anderson looked out for Thomas. She didn't have anyone who cared for her like that. Perhaps it was time she started letting good people take care of her. Mrs. Anderson, without a doubt, was a nice lady, and Gail couldn't understand why she was so intent on giving the old lady a hard time. Thomas, on the other hand, could be her future if only she let him in. He had shown her that he really wanted her here, and she had to admit that her heart was slowly opening to up him. She would make her feelings known no matter the outcome, she decided. After dinner that evening, Thomas stayed back to talk to Mrs. Anderson. Whatever she wanted to tell him must have been serious for her to want to speak with him alone. Henry hadn't told him much, only saying that Mrs. Anderson looked quite disturbed. "It's about Miss Dwight," she started when they were finally alone. "What about her?" he asked, his interest piqued. "Are you sure you still want to go through with the wedding?" she answered him with another question. "I don't see why not," he answered. "Have you noticed anything, or do you know something? Something about her behavior is off. Haven't you noticed anything at all?" she asked, and Thomas looked bewildered for a second. "She was born and bred in the city. She isn't like our girls here," he answered. "So were Violet and Lindsay. Something isn't right about her," she said. "All I'm saying is that you should be very careful. I wouldn't go through with the wedding if I were you." "I can't call off the wedding now. It would be too embarrassing for both of us," Thomas answered, and Mrs. Anderson could see how torn he was. "I understand, Thomas. Just be very careful with her. I'd hate to see your heart broken," she said, wishing that there was a way she could unmask Gail before the wedding. Sadly, there wasn't. Thomas tossed and turned in his bed. Mrs. Anderson's words echoed in his mind. He had been too embarrassed to tell her that her fears weren't unfounded. He'd noticed something was amiss about Gail from the moment he picked her up from the train station, but had kept all that to himself. He'd gone ahead and made plans for the wedding, even though doubts still lingered in his mind. Stopping the wedding now wasn't an option, and all he hoped for was that Gail was only struggling to fit in and she would come around when they were finally married. Chapter 10. The next morning, Thomas was woken up with a start by a light streaming in through the closed drapes. He could barely see the time on the wall clock in his bleary state, and when he did, he was shocked to learn that it was almost 8 in the morning. He quickly jumped out of bed, changed from his nightwear into a pair of jeans and a checked shirt. He couldn't remember the last time he'd woken up this late, but he did understand what brought all this on. He went over to the window overlooking the stables, and he was delighted to see both Henry and Greg chatting animatedly as they saddled up their horses. He decided to rush over to them before they left and explain why he'd overslept earlier that morning. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Henry shouted as he saw Thomas approaching. "Good morning. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about. You know very well the sun has never caught me in bed," he said. "Don't worry, Thomas. We understand the pressure you must be under with the wedding preparations and all," Greg interjected. "That's why we decided not to wake you up. I saw the light under your door last night way past midnight. Did your talk with Mrs. Anderson go well?" Henry asked. "Yes, it went well. I had a lot in my mind and I couldn't fall asleep," Thomas answered, trying to sound as normal as possible. There was no need to worry his brothers. "You'll let us know if you need any help from us, won't you?" Henry said, placing a comforting hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Of course I will," Thomas answered, and he truly meant it. "Well, Greg, let's get going. The land won't plow itself now, will it?" Henry said as he mounted his horse, gave a subtle kick on its sides, and the beast took off with Greg and his horse following suit. Thomas watched as his brothers rode off until they were out of range, and all he could see was a thick cloud of dust. He should have been going out there with them. It was unlike him to be so preoccupied with something, and he knew it was time he got some answers. Since Gail arrived, they hadn't sat down together to discuss their wedding, or even about their life thereafter. He knew she'd be awake as he raced up the stairs, determined to know what lay ahead for them. "Good morning, Gail. I was wondering if I could have a minute of your time," he said as soon as she opened the door. "Good morning, Thomas. Yes, I've been meaning to speak to you as well," she answered. She then stepped out of the room and followed him down the stairs and into the drawing room. Thomas watched as she walked over to her seat, and he was once again awestruck by how beautiful and elegant she was. "I will go first. I know I have behaved untowardly to you and your family. To Mrs. Anderson as well, who has been nothing but kind to me," she said, and Thomas could see tears glistening in her eyes. "That's exactly what I wanted to speak to you about. It's only a couple of days before our wedding, but you don't seem interested. Am I missing something?" he asked, his voice breaking with sadness. "I want nothing more than to marry you, but there are so many things about me you don't know about," she said as she finally broke into a torrent of tears. "You know you can tell me anything, my dear. Whatever it is, we will face it together," he said as he pulled her into his arms and let her sob in his chest. "I wish it was that easy," she sobbed. "It is, my dear, it is," he said, and she calmed down somewhat. She would have gladly given up on all she stood to inherit at that moment, but she simply couldn't. It all meant so much to her. His voice as he called her his dear made her heart almost explode with sheer joy. "Do you still want to marry me?" he asked as he turned her face up to his. "With every fiber in my body," she answered truthfully. "And whatever happens, never forget how much you mean to me." "You too, my darling, and nothing will happen," he answered. They embraced and then broke away quickly, each embarrassed by being overcome with emotion. They spent the rest of the day together, and Thomas showed her around the ranch. He showed her where he planned to build their new home after they were married. Gail's heart was in turmoil seeing how excited he was. She truly was falling in love with this man, and she soon was going to break his heart terribly. A lump rose in her throat, and she swallowed hard as she fought back tears. Chapter 11. It was the morning of the wedding, and Gail dragged herself lazily out of bed. She had spent the last couple of days pretending to look forward to this day. Mrs. Anderson, she could tell, wasn't easily fooled. The worst part was when she had to pretend that she loved her wedding gown, with Mrs. Anderson constantly telling her how beautiful she looked in it. She couldn't believe that Thomas had bought her a dress of such an ill-fitting and cheap material. It would have been okay, though, if she were truly committed to this marriage. The old lady was due in at any minute to help her get ready and make sure they were in the chapel in good time. Thomas was not allowed to see her before then, as they believed that would bring about bad luck. Gail dragged her unwilling body to the washroom. The wash basin was old. The towels were thin and the water was tepid. She preferred to bath in hot water, but since her arrival here, she'd had to make do with whatever was provided. She was done in no time, and as if on cue, Mrs. Anderson knocked on the door. "Mrs. Anderson, it's so nice to see you. I have been worried that you wouldn't get here on time," Gail said in a cheerful voice as soon as she opened the door. "I wouldn't be late for anything. Today I want everything to go well for my dear Thomas," she answered. She hoped she'd made it clear to Gail that she was only here for Thomas's sake. "It certainly will, Mrs. Anderson. My gut tells me so," Gail answered. "Good. I think you should have breakfast before we dress you up," Mrs. Anderson said. "I think so too. My tummy feels a bit queasy, but I'll have a cup of tea," Gail said. It was true that her tummy was queasy, but it was from all the excitement of finally having full access to her riches. "That's all right, Miss Dwight. You can have something more solid to eat at the party after the ceremony," Mrs. Anderson said. "Oh, Mrs. Anderson, don't you think it's time you dropped the formalities? We are practically a family now. Call me Gail, please, will you?" Gail said. "Okay, Gail, let's hurry up. We don't want to keep our dear Thomas waiting now, do we?" Mrs. Anderson answered and managed a tiny smile. They spent the next half an hour adjusting the dress here and there until finally they were both satisfied with the outcome. Mrs. Anderson thought Gail looked very pure in the white gown, and her curly auburn hair beneath the veil gave an angelic aura about her. It saddened the older lady that nothing was further from the truth. Gail, on the other hand, was thinking how horribly the gown looked on her. She could feel the material scratching at her back, was pulling, and it made her look fat. "I think you look very beautiful, Gail. Thomas will be breathless when he sees you," Mrs. Anderson gushed. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I know he will be looking handsome as well, Gail said, a fake smile on her lips. On the inside, she wanted to curl into a ball and scream at the top of her lungs. All right, the coachman must be waiting downstairs. Let's not keep him waiting any longer. The older lady said as she slowly led Gail down the flight of stairs and into the waiting coach. They arrived at the chapel on time, and Mrs. Anderson could see Storm with his family as well as Eric with his. Henry and Greg were seated together while Thomas stood nervously at the front as he waited for his bride. Friends of the family graced the occasion in impressive numbers, almost filling the small chapel to its capacity. The ceremony went on without a hitch, and as everyone cheered and made merry, Mrs. Anderson observed Gail standing next to her husband with a faraway look in her eyes. Thomas felt the distance as well as he stood next to his wife. When the pastor had instructed them to say their vows, Thomas had said his without any hesitation, but Gail had hesitated for a minute, forcing the pastor to repeat his request. When she finally did say them, there was a coldness in her voice that Thomas couldn't understand. Now, as they stood together acknowledging well wishes from their guests, Gail seemed lost in her own world. Is something the matter, love? Thomas finally asked. No, my darling, all is well, she said, and managed a smile, but inside her heart was breaking. But you don't look happy. I thought you wanted this as much as I did, Thomas said, as his heart shattered. Mrs. Anderson's words echoed through his mind, and he now wished he'd listened to her. I'm very happy. A bit tired, perhaps, but I'm happy. I promise, she answered, avoiding his gaze. The rest of the evening was a blur to Thomas. He tried to act normal in front of his family and friends, but the pain in his heart was too much. Gail stayed by his side the whole time, cold and distant. Chapter 12. I would love for you to move into my room now that we are married, Thomas said as soon they arrived back home after the party. I would love to, but does it have to be tonight? Gail asked. Well, I don't mean immediately. Take your time, but don't take forever, Thomas said with a smile. Soon, my love, soon, Gail answered. I would now like to rest a bit in my room, please. All right, my love, Thomas answered as he walked closer to her, took her face in his hands, and placed a gentle kiss on her lips. She returned his kiss and then turned and went to her room. Thomas watched her walk away, his heart anguished. When they had spoken about the wedding earlier, she had been over the moon. Now she seemed not to care and wasn't as excited as he was. He entered the drawing room, went to stand by the window, and looked outside. In the distance, he could clearly see the spot where he planned to build his new home for his family. He wondered whether Gail was still as excited as she had been when they toured the area. Why are you here all by yourself, Thomas? I thought you would be with your wife, Greg asked excitedly, unaware of the magnitude of the issue. Gail has gone up to her room. She was feeling rather worn out after the party, Thomas answered, and he could feel Mrs. Anderson's eyes burning into him. Henry, could you and Greg check the range for me? The stove isn't lighting up well as it should, Mrs. Anderson said, and Henry immediately knew that she wanted to speak with Thomas alone. As soon as they left the room, she locked the door, walked over to Thomas, and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. What happened, dear? Has something happened? She implored softly. You were right, Mrs. Anderson. I shouldn't have rushed into this marriage, Thomas answered, and the look in his eyes as he looked at the older lady tore her heart into pieces. Tell me what happened, she coaxed him. She doesn't feel the same about me as much as I do her, Thomas answered. Did she say that? She asked. She didn't need to. I could see it in her eyes, he answered. What are you going to do now? Mrs. Anderson asked. I don't know, ma'am, Thomas answered, his look far and distant. Mrs. Anderson couldn't believe the person standing before her was her carefree Thomas. The one standing there was a former shell of himself, beaten and defeated. A solitary tear snaked down her cheek, and she hastily swiped it away before he could see it. The situation didn't get any easier in the days that followed. Mrs. Anderson was no longer coming around, and Gail still refused to move into Thomas's room. She would get angry whenever Thomas tried talking to her. She spent her days locked up in her room and would throw a tantrum whenever she was questioned. Henry and Greg were shocked seeing that side of her, but they always kept their distance and never interfered. "Tell me what you would like me to do to make your stay here comfortable," Thomas asked one morning when he found her seated alone in the drawing room. "I don't know. Maybe you could change these old couches, these old drapes, and the shoddy pots and pans in the kitchen," she yelled, and Thomas was taken aback. Why was she always this angry? Lost for words, Thomas walked out of the room and went to the stables. He needed to go for a ride to clear his mind. He really wanted this marriage to work, but he was quickly running out of ideas. Divorce was the last thing on his mind, but he feared that he would lose his mind if Gail didn't come around soon. With nowhere to go, Thomas circled around the ranch a number of times, always avoiding being seen by either Storm or Eric. He was in no mood to answer any questions about Gail, as he was sure that was what they would ask him about. It was almost dark when he rode back home, and something about the house unsettled him. It was in complete darkness. Gail's room, which should have had a light at this time, was dark as well. His brothers had gone to the neighboring town on business, and he didn't expect them back until late. He slowly approached the front door and was shocked to find that it was unlocked. Fearing that there might be bandits inside the house, he quietly lit a lamp, armed himself with a huge iron bar, and slowly proceeded to check every room in the house. Nothing seemed to be out of order. He then decided to go and check on Gail. Maybe she was feeling a bit under the weather and had gone to bed early. He knocked on the door a couple of times and received no reply. Now, truly worried for her safety, he slowly pushed the door open and walked inside. Her bed was neatly made and nothing looked out of the ordinary. Panic now creeping slowly in his heart, he went over to the wardrobe, and not a single piece of her clothing was there. Her bags were also missing. The window had been left open. He went over, closed the window and the drapes. Nothing showed that a lady had been living in that room. It suddenly dawned on him that she had left. She could no longer cope with living here, he thought. Thomas felt as if someone had punched him in the gut as he slowly sank down on the bed. He had been angry with her and was contemplating divorcing her, but the realization that she had left him was too much to bear. He collapsed on the bed, huge sobs racking his whole body. Chapter 13. Gail looked again at her surroundings, and a tear fell from her eye. She wondered once again whether she'd made the right decision running away from Thomas. The room she was living in was worse than the one she'd left back in Denver. In fact, the one back in Denver was heavenly compared to this. It had been a week now, and the sale for the company still hadn't gone through. Gilbert had assured her that it wasn't going to take long, but she could see now that he hadn't been right. He probably had no idea. Her mind went back to the day she'd run away from Thomas. She'd heard the younger brothers discussing their upcoming business trip, and she'd known that this was the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. Earlier on, she had approached the coachman and asked him to buy a train ticket to New York. He was under strict instructions not to give out this information to anyone. She had paid him for his silence with the money they had received as a gift for the wedding. Everything had worked out as she'd wanted, and now here she was, back in New York. On arrival, she'd gone straight to Gilbert's office to let him know that she was now back to claim what was rightfully hers. "Gail, you didn't inform me you were coming," Gilbert said, clearly shocked to see her standing in his office. He pointed her towards a chair, opposite from him. "There was no time for explanations, Gilbert. It doesn't matter, though. Here I am," she answered as she sat down. "Do you have what is required of you?" he asked, expecting her to come up with excuses. She couldn't have gotten married that soon, he thought. "Here," she said as she shoved the marriage license in his hand. Gilbert looked it over to make sure it was a legal document, and finally he was convinced that it truly was. "Impressive, Gail. How and when did all this happen? And where is your husband?" Gilbert asked, wanting to know every little detail. "That's a story for another day, Gilbert. I'll need my house keys now. It's been a long and tiresome trip." Gail said, a yawn escaping her. She did look exhausted, Gilbert observed. "We have a small problem, Gail. I had to sell the house in your absence," he said, and Gail's eyes opened wide in shock. What? Why would you do that, Gilbert? Where am I going to stay as I wait for the whole process to go through? She asked, her face contorted in pain. We had to repair the railroad company somehow and keep it running. You suddenly left, and I therefore decided to sell the house and use that money. Don't worry, the company is doing well, and you can buy another house whenever you want. But for now, you need to make alternative living arrangements, Gilbert explained. I don't intend to keep the company. I want you to fire all the workers and hastily make plans to sell it. What about the money left in the bank? She asked, now very confused. There isn't that much money in the bank. Your parents wanted you to run the company and learn how to make money yourself. Whatever was left in the bank won't last you long, Gilbert said as he observed Gail carefully. He was glad that her parents wanted to teach her to be responsible, but it was a pity she didn't see things that way. Now here she was living in a rundown boarding house, fast running out of the money she had received from the bank, and with no hope of her company getting a buyer anytime soon. She had never felt as lonely as she did now. She had no friends, and the townfolk who knew her went out of their way to avoid her. Many times, she caught herself thinking about Thomas, his warm, welcoming eyes, and his strong, confident gait as he walked. She would find herself smiling as those thoughts ran through her mind. She missed the exciting banter around the dining table when they all sat down for meals. Autumn was upon New York, and Gail still waited, but still nobody showed any interest in buying her company. She would urge Gilbert to hurry up and have it sold, but he always told her that unless someone showed interest, his hands were tied. She spent most of her time in her dull room, standing by the window as she watched people on the streets below going about their business. The few times she ventured outside, she would be mesmerized by the trees shedding their leaves, littering the streets with different colors from green to orange, yellow, and red. Fall was the most beautiful season in New York. It became worse during Thanksgiving. She sat alone in her room as families enjoyed each other's company. She could hear them on the streets below, and some celebrated right there at the boarding house. With tears glistening in her eyes, she walked over to her bag and counted the money she had left. Her mind was now fully made up, and she knew exactly what she needed to do. The money was just enough to buy a train ticket to Denver. The first light found her at Gilbert's office door as she patiently waited for him to arrive. "Good morning, Gail. What brings you here this early?" Gilbert asked, surprised to find her at his door. "Good morning, Gilbert. I need you to watch over my company, and please hold off on selling it," she said. "I will be happy to. But why?" he asked, glad that she'd decided to keep it. "I'm leaving tomorrow on the morning train," she answered. "Oh, I see. Where are you going this time?" Gilbert asked. "Denver, Colorado," she answered, and Gilbert thought he saw a hint of a smile on her lips. Chapter 14. Thomas looked over the room that had once been occupied by his wife, and the dull ache in his heart washed over him once more. Months had gone by since she abruptly left, and it seemed she took off with a piece of his heart as well. He walked over to the wardrobe where he had stored the bed linens, and months later, her delicate scent still lingered on them. Everything Gail had left in the room had been carefully packed away by Mrs. Anderson, hoping that not seeing them would help Thomas forget Gail faster. Everyone had been on his back to have his marriage annulled, and he'd promised to have it done after Christmas. "Thomas, it's not healthy for you to keep visiting this room," a voice said from the doorway. Thomas turned to see Henry standing there with a worried look on his face. "Don't worry, Henry. I am coping just fine. The room has to be kept in good shape. We don't know who else will be in need of it," Thomas said as he winked knowingly at his brother. "Now, hold on just a minute. We are talking about you here," Henry answered. He was happy to see that Thomas was going back to his former self. It was only a matter of time, and he would forget Gail completely, Henry thought. "Say, what do you propose we do for Thanksgiving?" Thomas asked. The festive season was almost upon them. It was time to make merry and forget about the past. "I was thinking we could invite the whole family here. That way, we'll have Violet and Lindsay cook for us," Henry answered, and they both burst out laughing. Great idea, Henry. We should invite Mrs. Anderson as well. We are the only family she has, Thomas proposed, and Henry nodded his agreement. The whole family celebrated Thanksgiving together at the ranch house. Storm's and Eric's children filled the air with happy shrieks and giggles, and everyone was having a wonderful time. The men discussed their businesses while the women took care of the children and made sure there was plenty of food for everyone. But in all the happiness, no one was bold enough to address the elephant in the room. Storm would often catch Thomas with a distant look on his face, and he didn't need anyone to tell him what was going through his brother's mind. He waited until everyone was busy enough and then pulled Thomas to the side. "We could go to Brooklyn and look for her, Thomas. I'll happily accompany you," Storm said when they were alone. "No, Storm. She doesn't love me. She never did. Going there would be a waste of time," Thomas answered, and Storm's heart broke for his brother. It was obvious that he still loved Gail, and her leaving had almost destroyed him. He always wore a brave face, but Storm could see that he was broken. "It could help if she said it to our faces, don't you think?" Storm tried to convince him. "I couldn't bear to see her and her reject me once again, Storm. I couldn't survive it," Thomas answered truthfully. He could never keep anything from Storm. "Okay, Thomas, if that's how you feel, always remember I'm here for you. Should you change your mind, brother," Storm said. "I know, brother. I know," Thomas answered. "Well, let's get back before they notice our absence." In the weeks that followed, Thomas kept himself busy with the ranch as he tried to block any memories of Gail from his mind. Sometimes, sadness would overcome him and he would be tempted to go to Storm and take him up on his offer. But then he would think of how Gail had left him so soon after their wedding and without an explanation. Who was to say she wouldn't do the same to him in New York? Time heals all, and he was confident that one day all this would be a distant memory. Christmas was a few days away, and the whole of Lucas' clan was busy with the preparations. Henry's and Greg's business venture had been a huge success, and that was something worth celebrating as well. Thomas hadn't given up on building his house, and each morning he would visit the spot and just stand there and imagine how beautiful it would look. Mrs. Anderson would visit the brothers and always made sure that she spent a big chunk of that time talking to Thomas about everything else apart from Gail. She couldn't even bring herself to mention her name. It was during such a time, one evening, while they sat outside on the porch, having tea and cake, an unfamiliar coach approached and turned into the ranch's driveway. They had no idea who it was, and Thomas thought that it could be someone who was interested in buying one of the horses that were for sale. "Who could that be?" Mrs. Anderson asked, as she squinted hard trying to make out who was about to alight. "I don't know, but it could be a business prospect," Thomas answered. The coachman alighted from his side and walked to the other side of the coach and held out his hand. To both Mrs. Anderson and Thomas's shock, the figure gingerly took the coachman's hand, slowly alighted, and they could both tell that it was a woman. The long skirts of her dress swayed gently in the evening breeze as she made her way to the ground. It took Thomas a few minutes to believe what he was seeing. Gail stood by the side of the coach, her gaze trained on him. Her eyes this time were soft and gentle, and her whole demeanor was different. Mrs. Anderson couldn't believe her eyes as well, and quickly went into the house. Those two needed to be alone, she figured. "Hello, Thomas," she greeted him softly as she slowly approached where he was seated. Thomas's mouth was so dry that he couldn't utter a word. He stood up from his seat and walked towards her. Instinctively, his arms opened for her, and she walked right into them. They stood there in complete silence, each feeling the other's warmth. Chapter 15. Long after everyone had gone to bed, Gail and Thomas sat by the fireplace huddled close to each other. It was still hard for either of them to believe that the other was truly there. Gail felt safe and secure as she laid her head on his chest. Thomas kissed the top of her head gently and placed his arms around her. She had poured her heart out to him, explaining why her earlier behavior had been so unbecoming. He in turn could tell that this time around, she was being truthful and wasn't keeping anything from him. She had, however, kept the fact that she was the owner of a railroad company back at home, and the condition therein for her to inherit it, saving this bit of news for last. "Honey, there is something I haven't told you," she began as she looked him straight in the eye. "What is it?" Thomas asked, hoping it wasn't any more bad news. "You don't have to worry about where you'll get the money to build our new home," she said and smiled at how puzzled he looked. "How is that possible? You are an orphan. Where would you get that money?" he asked. "My parents left the railroad company to me. That was why I was in such a hurry to get married. It was a condition for me to finally get access to the company," she explained, and she saw his face change. "You used me. How could you do this to me?" he asked, the hurt in his face too much for her to bear. "No, Thomas, I didn't use you. That was the initial plan, but I ended up falling in love with this place, your brothers, and more importantly, you, my love," she explained quickly, her eyes filling up with tears as she willed him to believe her. "I don't know if I can forgive such a betrayal," he said as he buried his face in his hands. "You can, because I love you." "Do you love me?" she asked gently, pulling his face from his hands. She held his face in her hands and looked deep into his eyes. "Yes, Gail, I love you more than life itself," he answered. "Then give me time to prove my love for you as well. I'm so sorry for hurting you so much," she said, and she had never been this truthful about anything in her life. Thomas walked to the window deep in thought. He drew back the drapes and looked outside, willing for a sign on what to do. A second later, he couldn't believe his eyes. Tiny snowflakes fell gently on the ground, and nothing could have been a more obvious sign than that. He walked back to Gail and sat down next to her. "Okay, my darling wife, you could start tonight, I think, and Merry Christmas," he said, and she smiled knowingly at him and kissed his lips softly. She had never been this happy before. "That's a great idea, my darling husband, and a Merry Christmas to you too," she said as they both stood up holding hands and disappeared into his room. Epilogue. Gail stood at her new bedroom window, her heart at peace. They'd finally finished building their home and had already moved in. The events of the past year were still deeply embedded in her mind. She had come so close to losing all that she held so dearly now. It had taken her quite a bit of time to convince everyone that this time she meant well. Mrs. Anderson had been the hardest nut to crack, but she understood that the older lady was only looking out for Thomas. There was no doubt in her mind now that Mrs. Anderson loved those brothers dearly. After Christmas last year, they'd both decided to go to New York and learn more about the business. Gilbert had stayed on as the family lawyer. He had been a great help, teaching them all they needed to know about the company for the 6 months that they'd stayed. As they both wished to live in Colorado, Gilbert had helped them find a trustworthy manager to run the company, while Thomas went about his ranch business in Denver. Thomas would only go there whenever he was needed or there was a crisis. This was such a time, and he'd been gone for over a month, leaving Gail alone at home. She didn't mind, though. It wasn't like she was totally alone. Everyone checked on her and made sure that she was okay. She was worried, though, that should the crisis take much longer to solve, Thomas wouldn't make it home for Christmas. She would become a bit sad whenever she thought of a Christmas without her husband. Earlier on, there had been talk about them moving back to New York to run the company together, but Gail would hear none of it. She was happy at the ranch, and that's where she wanted to raise her family. And speaking of family, Gail rubbed her tummy gently, thinking of the surprise she was going to share with Thomas when he came back. In the distance, she could see a movement, and when it got closer, she saw it was the familiar coach that brought Thomas home whenever he returned from New York. He was finally here and would be spending Christmas with her. Excitedly, she rushed outside to welcome him home. "I was afraid you wouldn't make it home for Christmas, darling," she said as she leapt into his open arms. "Nothing can keep me away from spending the holidays with you. Christmas means so much to me," he said, his mind going back to the Christmas when she'd come back to him. "I know, my darling. I hold similar sentiments as well," she said, as she thought about that Christmas as well. "I'd hate for you to be all alone here. I really would," he said as they walked into the house together. I have a feeling that won't always be the case should you have a crisis at work and have to stay longer, she said, smiling. Why do you say that? I'd hate for that to happen. Christmas alone is the worst thing that can happen to a person, he said, not realizing they weren't talking about the same thing. I'm telling you, I won't be spending my days alone anymore, she said as she gently rubbed her tummy suggestively. His eyes opened wide as it dawned on him what she was on about. He picked her up from the floor, swung her around a couple of times in glee. This was how he'd always envisioned his life to be. He couldn't have wished for anything more.